Hello and welcome to the final segment of your reading homework. This is the last segment, pages 95 to 100. All right, so let's start on page 95. And if you've laid a block a bit out of true, it would immediately freeze too and set crooked. Then you would need the back of your axe to knock it off and chip away the mortar. But Shukov made no mistakes. The blocks varied. If any had chipped corners or broken edges or lumps on their sides, he noticed it at once and saw which way up to lay them and where they could best fit on the wall. Here was one. Shukov took up some of the steaming mortar on his trowel and slapped it into the appropriate place with his mind on the joint below. This would have to come right in the middle of the block he was going to lay. He slapped on just enough mortar to go under the one block. He snatched it from the pile carefully, though so as not to tear his mittens, for with cement blocks you can do that in no time. He smoothed the mortar with his trowel and then down with the block, and without losing a moment he leveled it, patting it with the side of the trowel. It wasn't lying exactly right, so that the wall would be truly in line and the block lie level both lengthwise and across. The mortar was already freezing. Now some mortar had oozed out to the side. You had to chop it off as quickly as possible with the edge of your trowel and fling it over the wall. In summer it would go under the next brick, but now that was impossible. Next you took another look at the joint below, for there were times when the block was not completely intact, but had partially crumbled. In that event, you slapped in some extra mortar where the defect was, and you didn't lay the block flat. You slid it from side to side, squeezing out the extra mortar between it and its neighbor. An eye on the plumb, an eye on the surface. Set. Next. The work went on with a rhythm. Once 2 rows were laid and the old faults leveled up, it would go quite smoothly, but now it was time to keep your eyes peeled. Shukov forged ahead. He pressed along the outside wall to meet Senka. Senka had parted with Tyrin in the corner and was now working along the wall to meet him. Shukov winked at the mortar carriers. Bring it up, steady, that's the ticket. He was working so fast he had no time to wipe his nose. He and Senka met and began to scoop out of the same mortar hod. It didn't take them long to scrape it to the bottom. Mortar! Shukov shouted over the wall. Coming up, shouted Pavlo. Another load arrived. They emptied that one too. All the liquid mortar in it anyhow. The rest had already frozen to the sides. Scrape it off yourselves. If you don't, you're the ones who'll be taking it up and down again. Get going. Next. And now Shukov and the other masons felt the cold no longer. Thanks to the urgent work, the first wave of heat had come over them. When you feel wet under your coat and under your jacket, under your shirt and your vest. But they didn't stop for a moment. They hurried on with the laying. And after an hour, they had their second flush of heat, the one that dries up their sweat. Their feet didn't feel cold. That was the main thing. Nothing else mattered. Even the breeze, light but piercing, couldn't distract them from the work. Only Senka stamped his feet. He had enormous ones, poor slob, and they'd given him a pair of Valenki too tight for him. From time to time, Tyrin would shout, mortar, and Shukov would shout, mortar. He was shouting to his own men. When you're working all out, you're sort of a squad leader to your neighbors yourself. It was up to Shukov to keep up with the other pair. Now he had made his own brother sweat to hurry up with the mortar. At first, after dinner, Buvinsky had carried mortar with Fitikov, but the ramp was steep and dangerous, and the captain dragged his feet to begin with. Shukov urged him on gently. Quicker, Captain. Blocks, Captain. Every time Vinovsky came up, he worked faster. Fitikov, on the other hand, grew lazier and lazier. Okay, guys, so Fitikov grew lazier and lazier. So notice, he's contrasting Fitikov with Vinovsky. Vinovsky, while he's trying to put forth his best effort in the midst of a hard situation, Fitikov simply just gets lazier. He tilted the barrel as he came up, the lousy bastard, so the mortar would slop out of it, and then it'd be lighter to carry. Shukov poked him in the back. Hey, you damn bastard, when you were in oversea, I'll bet you made your men sweat. Vinovsky appealed to the squad leader. Give me a man to work with. I won't go on working with this shit. Tyrin agreed. He sent Fitikov to heave up blocks from below and made him work on top of that, where the number of blocks he handled was counted separately. He told Alosha to work with the captain. Alosha was a quiet man. Anyone could order him about. It's all hands on deck, sailor, the captain urged. See how fast they're laying blocks? Alosha smiled meekly. If we have to work faster, then let's work faster. Anything you say. And tramped down for the next load. Thank God for the man who does his job and keeps his mouth shut. Tyrin shouted to someone down below. Another truckload of blocks had apparently arrived. Not one been brought here for 6 months. Now they were pouring in. You could work really fast as long as the trucks brought blocks, but this wouldn't go on. Later they'd be holed up in the delivery, and then you'd stand idle yourself. Tyrin was bawling out someone else below. something about the lift. Shukov would have liked to know what was up, but he had no time to find out. He was leveling his wall. The carriers came up and told him a mechanic had come to repair the motor of the lift, and the superintendent of electrical repairs, a civilian, was with him. The mechanic was tinkering with the motor. The superintendent watched. That was according to the rules. One man works, one man watch. Good. If they fix the lift now, it could be of use for both blocks and motor. Shukov was laying his third row. Kilgus, too, was on his third. When up the ramp came yet another snoop, another chief, building foreman Dur, a Muscovite, used to work in some ministry, so they said. Shukov was standing close to Kilgus and drew his attention to Dur. Fast, said Kilgus contemptuously. I don't usually have anything to do with the big shots, but you call me if he falls off the ramp. And now Dur took up his post behind the masons and watched them work. Shukov hated these snoops like poison, trying to make himself into an engineer, the fathead. Once he had shown Shukov how to lay bricks and given him a belly laugh. A man should build a horse with his own hands before he calls himself an engineer. A man should build a house with his own hands before he calls himself an engineer. At Shukov's village of Temgenovo, there were no brick houses. All the cottages were built of wood. The school, too, was a wooden building made from 6-foot logs. But the camp needed masons, and Shukov, glad to oblige, became a mason. A man with 2 trades to his credit can easily learn from another 10. No, Dur didn't fall off the ramp, though once he stumbled. He came up almost on the double. Turin, he shouted, his eyes popping off his head. Turin. At his heels came Pavel. He was carrying the spade he'd been working with. Dur was wearing a regulation camp coat, but it was new and clean. His hat was stylish, made of leather, though like everyone else's it bore number B731. Well, Turin went up to him, trowel in hand, his hat tilted over one eye. Something out of the ordinary was brewing, something not to be missed. Yet the mortar was growing cold in the barrows. Shukov went on working and listening. What do you think you're doing? Dur spluttered. This isn't a matter for your guardhouse. This is a criminal offense, Turin. You'll get a 3rd term for this. Only then did Shukov catch on to what was up. He glanced at Kilgus. He'd understood, too. The roofing felt. Dur had spotted it on the windows. Shukov feared nothing for himself. His squad leader would never give him away. He was afraid for Turin. To the squad, Turin was a father. For them, he was a pawn. Up in the north, they readily gave squad leaders a 2nd term for a thing like this. Ugh, what a face Turin made. He threw down his trowel and took a step towards Dur. Dur looked around. Pavel lifted his spade. He hadn't grabbed it for nothing, and Senka, for all his deafness, had understood. He came up, hands on hips, and Senka was built solid. Dur blinked, gave a sort of twitch, and looked around for a way of escape. Turin leaned up against him and said quite softly, though distinctly enough for everyone to hear, Your time for giving terms has passed, you bastard. If you say one word, you bloodsucker, it'll be your last day on earth. Remember that. Turin shook uncontrollably. Hatchet-faced Pavel looked at Dur straight in the eye, a look as sharp as a razor. Now, men, take it easy. Dur turned pale and edged away from the ramp. Without another word, Turin straightened his hat, picked up his trowel, and walked back to his wall. Pavel very slowly went down the ramp with a spade, slowly. Dur was as scared as to stay as to leave. He took shelter behind Kilgus and stood there. Kilgus went on laying blocks the way they count out pills at a drugstore like a doctor, measuring everything so carefully, his back to Dur, as if he didn't even know he was there. Dur stole up to Turin. Where was all that his arrogance? But what shall I tell the superintendent, Turin? Turin went on working. He said without turning his head, You will tell him it was like that when we arrived. We came, and that's how it was. Dur waited a little longer. They weren't going to bump him off now, he saw. He took a few steps and put his hands in his pockets. Hey, S854, he muttered. Why are you using such a thin layer of mortar? He had to get back at someone. He couldn't find fault with Shukov for his joints or for the straightness of his line, so he decided he was laying the mortar too thin. Permit me to point out, Shukov lisped derisively, that the mortar is laid on thick in weather like this, the place will be like a sieve in the spring. You're a mason. Listen to what a foreman has to tell you, Dur said with a frown puffing out his cheeks. Well, here and there it might be a bit on the thin side. He could have used a little more, but only after all, if he'd been laying the blocks in decent conditions, not in winter. The man ought to have a heart. You've got to show some results. But what was the good of trying to explain? He didn't want to understand. Dur went quietly down the ramp. You get me that lift repaired, Turin sang out after him. What do you think we are, pack horses, carrying blocks up to the 2nd story by hand? They'll pay you for taking them up, Dur called from the ramp quite humbly. At the wheelbarrow rate? Child's play, pushing up a wheelbarrow. All right, guys, we're going to stop right there. That's the end of your reading homework. God bless you and have a great day.